Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Federation's Summer Educational Series, Looking Back, Moving Forward, DEI Stories Touching Medical Regulation. My name is David Johnson, Chief Assessment Officer at the Federation of State Medical Boards, and I will be serving as your host for this series. I am so pleased that we are kicking off this series with the presentation by today's speaker, Dr. Lois Nora. Dr. Nora is the former president and CEO of the American Board of Medical Specialties. She's a medical educator, in fact, president emeritus and dean of medicine emeritus at Northeast Ohio Medical University. Today, Dr. Nora will share her research on women in U.S. medical regulation, insights from 100 years of photographs. Dr. Nora has prepared a 30-minute talk for us. And as you listen along the way, please use the live Q&A feature so that you can pose your questions or comments, because we'll have ample time for conversation afterwards. Now with that, Dr. Nora, I would like to turn things over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be with all of you. My compliments to the Federation of State Medical Boards for sponsoring this important series on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today, I am privileged to share with you some work that colleagues and I have done looking at the history of women in professional regulation with a focus on the photographs that were presented across a century in formal publications of the Federation of State Medical Boards. Please note my disclosures and acknowledgments. This work is the collective product of Sheila Dela Cruz, Carol Clothier, and Dr. Terry Stratton. We acknowledge and thank the FSMB, and particularly Ms. Roxanne Huff, for assistance during this project, even during the pandemic. This afternoon, I will discuss the origins of this work and how it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I will show examples of photographs of women from Federation documents, share insights, and describe next steps in our work. Following my formal presentation, I'm delighted that we have abundant time for discussion and for me to hear your insights. Like many physicians trained in the 1970s and 80s, I regularly passed through classrooms, auditoriums, and hospital corridors whose walls, like these, were covered with formal portraits of white men who were the founders and leaders of the organization. I never questioned these hallways. In fact, I was pleased that and took pride that some of those portraits and a few of those hallways were of my family members. And let me emphasize today that I recognize, value, and respect the contributions of all these men. Recognizing the contributions of women does not in any way undermine the work that they have done and the fact that they should be recognized. That said, occasionally as I walk through those hallways, I did ask, where are the women? During my later training and as a career as a neurologist and medical educator, I became more aware of the different experiences of many students, residents, physicians, and scientists from underrepresented and medicine groups, including women. As a result, my early scholarship focused on gender-related issues and the learning environment for medical students. As this might suggest, my earliest interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion in medical education focused on what I saw as the moral imperative, based in virtues of justice, fairness, and integrity. As I took on progressive leadership roles through my career, I came to understand the importance of DEI from the business and healthcare perspectives as well. The business literature has well documented that while discussions may take longer and decision-making may be more complicated in organizations with diverse governance boards and C-suites, the resulting decisions are in fact better and the companies are more successful. The pandemic has been only the latest reinforcement that diversity-related issues have important implications for healthcare access and outcomes. Consequently, leaders must understand the importance of these issues, should recruit and retain diverse individuals in their organization, champion supportive policies, and foster understanding. After an extended career in medical education, I was honored to be chosen to lead the American Board of Medical Specialties, the largest coordinating organization supporting physician certification in the United States. As I introduced myself to our boards and I read their histories, I found myself asking a familiar question: where were the women? During this time, I also became more familiar, with the work of the state medical boards and the FSMB. And as I explored those histories, a history that to me seems particularly important, given the non-voluntary nature of medical licensure, the breadth of issues that come across the transom of state medical boards, and the importance of the decisions they make for the health of the public, I again found myself asking the question, where were the women? You'll see on the slide a quote from one of the songs from Hamilton, talking about or asking the question, who tells our story? Who keeps our flame? Who remembers our name? I became very interested in the stories and names of history of women in professional regulation. Now, our team is neither the first nor the only to be interested in this history. Our host today, David Johnson, with Hank Chaudhry, authored the definitive history of the Federation of State Medical Boards. That work, together with David's more recent book, Diploma Mills, The Rise and Fall of John Buchanan and the Eclectic Medical College of Pennsylvania, and David's blog, The Armchair Historian, offer wonderful insights into a variety of topics important to medical regulation. One of those topics has been the women. In his blog, Johnson reports on the first woman to serve on a state medical board. Dr. Adele Hutchinson graduated from the Boston University School of Medicine in 1877 and later traveled west to Minnesota because the frontier was more open to female physicians. Dr. Hutchinson began a successful practice and participated in organized medicine through the Minnesota Homeopathic Society. Appointed in 1903 to the Minnesota State Medical Board, she served 2 terms, including service as president of the board. Among her many professional contributions was being involved in the founding of the medical school that currently is the University of Minnesota School of Medicine. As her second term came to an end, the Women's Medical Club of Minneapolis, which included prominent physicians who were also suffragettes, determined that another woman physician would continue to be on the board. That led to the appointment of Dr. Margaret Cook, who served for 2 terms. We don't have a picture of Dr. Cook, but we do have a picture of the 3rd woman who succeeded her on this state board, Dr. Anna Hurd, shown here in the circle. So the Minnesota Medical Board had a sustained history of women over a decade. I point out Dr. Hurd not only as the 3rd woman to serve on the state medical board, but also as the daughter of Dr. Ethel Hurd, the woman standing to her right. Dr. Ethel Hurd was a noted suffragette who attended medical school as an adult, graduating 3 years before her daughter did. I have pointed out a career-long interest in the history of women in medicine that has morphed into wanting to tell the story of women in professional regulation. In the summer of 2018, a group of us began work to try and tell these stories. As we began reviewing the historical archives at the FSMB, our colleague Sheila Dela Cruz, then an undergraduate at Harvard College, brought up the possibility of looking at photographs that accompanied some of the written materials we were reviewing. Since the advent of photography, Photos have played an important role in defining and memorializing key moments in history. These two images, for example, are likely well known to all of us. Photographs have also played an important role in understanding women's history. This picture defines a key moment in sports, where a race official is attempting to remove Catherine Switzer from the Boston Marathon course so that she could not finish that race. Women at that time were not allowed to run in the Boston Marathon. I'm happy to say that she did finish. Our goal in this project was to use photographs to better understand the history of women in professional regulation. What photographs were taken? What kind of photograph was it? What did it show? And which photographs were published? These were some of the questions we asked ourselves as we reviewed publications of the FSMB, including their formal bulletin and their less formal newsletter. We reviewed all photographs that included people from the years 1913 through 2015. Two raters independently classified each photograph according to pre-specified criteria. A third person reviewed their classifications and identified if there was a disagreement. If a disagreement, the two initial reviewers attempted to come to consensus, and if not, the third person made the decision. We then reviewed our data for insights and trends. Pictures were categorized in a variety of ways by the type of photograph, whether or not it was on the cover, and numbers of male and females in the photographs. For photographs that were of an individual, and this accounted for the great majority of them, we also attempted to identify the activity associated or pictured in the photograph and the organizational home of that individual. Now, this rather busy graph demonstrates the total number of photographs by decades, 1,681. There were individual years without photos, and there are striking differences in the number of photographs across the years, as you can see. From top to bottom, the 5 lines represent, in gray, photographs of a single man, by far and away the most common photograph that we saw. Line blue shows photographs picturing multiple men. The next line down, green, photographs that included both men and women. The red line represents photographs that included a single woman, and yellow, photographs that included multiple women. As suggested by this graph, photographs that included women accounted for approximately 10% of the total. You'll also see that we identified 3 phases based upon the numbers and types of photographs, and I will be talking about what happened in each of those phases. Now, taking advantage of our visual medium today, I'm going to be focusing on the actual photos and the stories they tell rather than the numbers or the context or the types of photos. Phase 1, spanning the years 1913 to 1959, included 140 total photographs, 16 of which included one or more women. Few of those 16 photographs are of women playing a role in medical regulation, and those photographs occur at the end of the phase. Nonetheless, how women are pictured is instructive and fun to see. 2 themes that emerge are law enforcement and women in distaff roles. A major use of the journal in its earliest days was communication and education among the boards about fraudulent physicians, criminal behavior, and counterfeit licenses. While more of the bad actors were men, women appeared as well. These photographs show the real Dr. Alma Pennington in the middle, and 2 women on either side who had forged her signature and were fraudulently using her license as fake physicians. Of interest, the caption to Alma Pennington's picture says, "Character shows in the face and signature of the real Alma Stevens Pennington." During these years, law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, also used the journal to advise physicians about criminals who might seek medical attention because of a medical problem they had. For example, Tamara Tucker on the left was wanted for passing fraudulent checks. She had a history of tuberculosis, and physicians were advised of that through this small article. Kathleen Nagler on the right was wanted for swindling and is described as having a scar from thyroid surgery and using medication for a thyroid condition. I mentioned that we saw women in distaff roles as well. Distaff is a term that refers to traditional women's work. And these years, 1913 through 1959, were a time when there were socially more acceptable types of work, both paid and voluntary, that were open to women, and other areas that were not so open to women. Pictures from this period demonstrate this. For example, these pictures from a 1941 article on the training of interns. Throughout the article, there are abundant pictures, and no women appear as interns or teaching physicians. However, they do appear, in some cases almost incidentally, as secretaries, librarians, and nurses. Traditionally, the ultimate distaff work is that of wife. In the late 1950s, we begin to see our first photographs of women involved in Federation activities. This photograph, for example, includes women likely at a social luncheon and most likely spouses. In the last years of Phase 1, we begin to see pictures of women in support roles for state medical boards. These pictures from 1957 and 1959 were the first ones published in the journal showing women staff assistants to the secretaries on 2 state medical boards. Let's move to Phase 2. Phase 2 extended between 1960 and 1989 and included the great majority of photographs that we reviewed. During this time, 1,292 photographs were published, and 163 of them included one or more women. During these years, we don't see law enforcement photographs anymore. Most of the photographs relate to educational programs, business decisions, state medical board elections, and social life of the Federation. The cover photo was a particularly prominent picture in terms of its size and its placement on the cover during this phase. Themes of the photographs during Phase 2 include the appearance of spouses, largely at social events, recognition of staff members who were retiring, and women appearing in new roles as teachers and participants as authors of articles in the journal. The photographs also show the gradual transition of women into executive and governance roles in the Federation and at the state boards. These are examples of the many photographs depicting wives. The majority of the social photographs show them as attendees at social events. However, the photographs also highlight that the wife of the FSMB executive and the wife of the leader of governance played substantially important roles, almost as a hostess for the social activities. One way this is recognized in pictures, for example, is the photograph on the right of Dr. Howard Horn, which incorporated not only him, but his wife. Photographs like these acknowledge staff members who had supported medical regulatory work at the state medical boards and Federation for decades. These 3 women alone accounted for 75 years of service to the mission of medical regulation. Dr. McKinley Crabb, longtime executive officer of the FSMB, said about Mabel Fisher, pictured on the right, "Perhaps a title like Cornerstone best describes what Mabel Fisher means to this Federation." And it seems likely that the same comment could be made about these other women who were cornerstones of their boards. In the 1970s and 80s, photographs of women began to emerge participating in meetings and educational sessions as article authors and as leaders. These are examples of some of those pictures. Interestingly enough, in these years, most of these women came from organizations outside the Federation, particularly the AMA, the National Board of Medical Examiners, and academia. Two photographs here of particular note include that of Dr. Rosemary Stevens in the upper left, an expert in medical regulation who was the first woman to give the named Platter Lecture and the first cover photo, and Dr. Edith Levitt, pictured in the bottom right, who was pictured on the cover 2 times, one near the beginning of her tenure as president of the National Board of Medical Examiners and another time near the end. And I would say that intervening, the pictures of Dr. Levitt were very prominent in the journal. It's clear that she played an important role in the work of medical regulation and an important partnership with FSMB. Although less prominent, there is also photographic indication of women's participation in the work of medical regulation. For example, Ms. Kate Hill came to the Federation and served as Assistant Vice President and Executive Director of the Flex Board. And Dorothy Fairclough, Executive Director of the State Medical Board of Florida, played a prominent role in the activities of the Federation, including multiple education sessions. And as these pictures of state medical boards published over the years demonstrate, women were also becoming engaged in governance as members of state medical boards. In many cases, these women were professional physician members, but also of note was the incorporation of women who played important roles as public members of these boards. At the level of Federation governance, Dr. Dorothy Bernstein, a Minneapolis psychiatrist, was named to a vacated treasurer spot in 1979. For unclear reasons, she was not nominated to continue in that position and only served a few months. Still, she was the first FSMB female board officer. In addition, the executive leader of the state medical boards had a named position on the FSMB board for many years, and at times this position was filled by a woman, as in this 1983 picture of Angelina Herbert, the executive secretary representative. A sea change appears to occur in the Federation during the last years of the 1980s. It begins with Dr. Susan Behrens from the Wisconsin Medical Board, who was elected to the FSMB board in 1985. And while she was the only woman on the board in 1985, over the next several years, she was joined by Ms. Susan Spalding, the public member from the Vermont Medical Board, and Dr. Barbara Schneidman from the Washington State Medical Board. All of these women served multiple years and would serve ultimately as presidents or chairs of the FSMB. In fact, this board picture of 1989-90 reveals 4 women in board positions and a senior woman executive, Kate Hill. It really appears that the end of the 1980s marked a turning point for women's involvement in the governance of FSMB. What had been a single woman sporadically serving in leadership positions became a consistent presence of multiple individuals serving in multiple roles across a period of time. Phase 3 extended from 1990 through 2015. Unfortunately, there are many years during this time period in which there are no pictures. This is related to the journal transitioning to publishing purely academic articles and a gradual movement to the newsletter as the vehicle for publishing photographs. Although there were only 289 photographs during this period, it's notable that 107 of them, more than 50%, include one or more women. During these years, we see substantial emergence and a consistent presence of women, including women of color. We also see women moving into executive and governance roles in both state boards and the Federation. These are the years of culture change. This 2002 Newsline page included Chair-elect Dr. Doris Brooker and introduced several new women directors of the FSMB board, including 2 women of color, Dr. Regina Benjamin and Dr. Frida Bush, both of whom would become chairs in future years. This slide shows a few of the many women who were recognized throughout the 2000s, with pictures depicting them as editors of the journal, major speakers, and award winners. And this page from a Newsline, updating people on news at the state medical boards, highlights that women are becoming well represented among the executive directors and state medical board leaders, with 5 of the announced 8 positions being women. Our work does have its limitations. Most notable among them, we think, are the editorial decisions that influence who is photographed and what photographs are published. But that is also part of the story that we are telling. We believe that our work, limited though it is to this point, demonstrates that review of photography can offer valuable insights into the history of women in medicine and medical regulation. While women were represented poorly over the entire century, their representation increased over time. Further, the roles that they played transitioned from being pictured solely as supportive to assuming executive and leadership roles. We also believe that our work suggests that the one and done approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion doesn't do it. A sustained number of multiple people from diverse backgrounds working together and working successfully across years appears to be very important. We were pleased to see the meaningful transition to women's inclusion that occurred during the 1980s and the culture change that really appeared to occur across the turn of the century. The photography work suggests, and I will say that the oral histories that we are doing now suggest even more, that this change in culture takes time, and allies and senior leadership support is critical. Going forward, we're asking continuing questions about this work. What were the contextual issues and factors during the time of this transition across the centuries? What impact, if any, did women's leadership have in the state medical boards? We're interested in the roles that the state medical boards played in advancing diversity at FSMB. Our work suggests that they were absolutely crucial to moving the national organization forward. The public member role appears very fascinating. We're interested in how often the public member might have been the first woman member on certain state boards. And we will look ultimately at how the experience within specialty certification boards compared with licensing boards. We hope that this work helps encourage organizations to explore their own history. And if you are interested in exploring, we hope that you'll welcome the chance to work collaboratively with us. I mentioned that we are doing oral histories of key individuals, and we welcome you letting us know if there is a key individual involved that you're aware of in medical regulation with whom we should speak. Again, to that quote of Lin-Manuel, we hope that our work is a small but real contribution to the diversity, equity, and inclusion that we all wish for through telling the stories and naming the names of women in professional regulation. I look forward to our discussion and to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lois. That was wonderfully just fascinating to see how much research and digging you've done to find so many of those photos and kind of tease out some really interesting stories along.
Well, we had a lot of fun doing it.
I'm going to be keeping a close eye on questions through our Q&A feature. I know folks are probably just now getting a chance to jump in there and pose a question or comment. So having thought that might be the case, Lois, I had a couple questions that I prepared I wanted to start with. One is the fact that I really loved the way that you opened with a personal experience or anecdote. You talked about walking into these rooms or lecture halls with prominent leaders pictured. And I love when you said, I never questioned these hallways, but then you shortly thereafter did mention at some point, though, the question began coming to mind for you, where are the women? So I'm curious, was there any particular moment or event that began to really turn your thoughts more explicitly to that question?
Well, it's interesting because I think it's symbolic that I really didn't question in that that particular picture that I used in the talk came from the internet. It wasn't a hallway that I trained in, but it was representative.
Hmm.
Um,
Right.
I I think in medical school, as I occasionally saw senior women, that might have highlighted it to me. But if there were two key things, I really believe that one of them was as a young professional and as a new assistant dean, working with medical students and really understanding kind of the different types and at times really challenging experiences that some of our women students had contributed very much to my becoming interested in this. And then I think as I assumed larger leadership roles, I was struck just from an interest in history that occasionally I was reading about women almost incidentally. And oftentimes the women were in helper roles, and yet it was very clear from what I was reading that the organizations would not have succeeded without their incredible work. So those would be two things that I think heightened my sensitivity to it.
Excellent. Well, as we were chatting, we've already had our first comment come through. So let me read this to you, Lois. From the audience member, she says, "Wow, thanks for the presentation. You made it clear that the participation of women and people of color is a very recent phenomenon and occurred during my own lifetime. It was fun to see names and faces that I personally have known through the FSMB. We must continue DEI efforts." I think one of the things that strikes me, Dr. Nora, is when this person said that this is a recent phenomenon during their own lifetime.
Well, I will tell you that I was surprised when I became Dean of Medicine in 2002 that the national story was that I was the 11th woman dean of a co-ed medical school in US history, which shocked me at the recency of that. But I absolutely agree. And as I mentioned, I am just so struck at the importance of the work of the state medical boards and the fact that this medical licensure is not voluntary and the issues are substantial.
Right.
So really making sure that there is diversity, equity, and inclusion within our professional regulation community is just absolutely crucial.
Oh, excellent point. Uh, Let me pose another question while there's another comment being typed in. You mentioned that the 1980s in particular seemed to you as a turning point for women in medical regulation. I'm curious, do you have any thoughts or theories as to why it was the 1980s as opposed to maybe a little bit earlier, the 70s or even before that?
It's a question that our team has thought a lot about, and one of our colleagues, Carol Clothier, I think is one of the audience today. So if she has any additions to this, I
Yeah.
really first recognize her work and ask her to type in and answer. As I think about it, I think that the second feminist revolution had occurred the decade before, and may have been setting the stage. Oftentimes, I mean, especially for the Federation, engagement of women at the state medical boards and oftentimes in their state medical associations and the like was crucially important before they would come into Federation leadership. So I think that is part of it. And also the explosion of medical schools in the 1970s increased the number of women who became physicians during those years. And so it may be that it was almost a lagging indicator as women needed to get to a certain level of practice or work in medicine before they would be considered for these roles.
You know, I'm struck, just, and this is somewhat anecdotal, Dr. Nora, but how often with individual boards, when they've put out, for example, a social media post during like Women's History Month or a Black History Month, how recently some of those additions or first individuals were to come onto those boards. And almost in each instance, we're talking the 1970s or 1980s. So I think you're spot on that the 1980s seemed to really be a turning point in the demographics. I see another comment through here, a question actually. This is from Nikki Kane. She says, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And it got a triple exclamation mark, and her question is, which was the most meaningful or impactful photograph for you, Dr. Nora, and why? You showed a number of them. So is there one that was most meaningful or impactful?
Well, first of all, thank you for that lovely compliment, Nikki. I appreciate it. I have to tell you that the photographs of criminals I found fascinating. That was completely unexpected, and I just absolutely loved them. But another one that had meaning for me, you notice that we use the words distaff. And what struck me is that one of the photographs that I showed actually began with the title of the photograph was The Distaff Side or something like that. And as I was doing work with the certification boards at the same time, they used that term. And it was a term that really we don't use today and I don't think of, but it really got me thinking about the helper role and how in many ways women, both voluntary in the roles of family members and women in helping roles as staff members, were absolutely crucial. And yet oftentimes their stories are not told. In fact, something that we're doing right now, I was pleased to see that oftentimes state medical board and federation staff were referred to with the formal Miss or Mrs. of the time and their name, Jane Doe or the like. But for the wives, they were not given their names. I mean, as was the social expectation at the time, they were Mrs. John Doe, Mrs. Sam Smith. And so that also, I think that has really put me on a trajectory where some of the conversations that we're having are the question of who is the Mrs.? Because I think there's this entire part of history where women who were spouses of prominent men had major roles in philanthropy, in decision making and the like, and yet we don't know their names anymore.
Yeah. You know, I'm going to jump ahead. There is a question or comment from actually Dr. Barbara Schneidman, who, as you mentioned,
hello,
elected
Dr.
chair
Barbara Schneidman.
and former CEO, president and CEO of FSMB. Dr. Schneidman writes, Lois, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I've often wondered, as medical boards increase the number of women members, did the awareness and seriousness of sexual boundary issues increase? And her question then is, do you think this will be an element of your research going forward?
Well, actually, it's a very interesting part of our research. I mentioned that one of the things that we're looking at is what impact did women's leadership have? And it's interesting that Dr. Schneidman would be one asking that question, because the focus on physician disruptive behavior of a sexual nature very much came into prominence and was looked at very seriously by the boards around the time of her ascending into leadership. And so that is one of the questions that we're asking ourselves.
Yeah. Another question from the audience, Dr. Nora. This is from Mark Woodland, Dr. Mark Woodland, I believe at the Pennsylvania board, if I'm remembering correctly. Lois, great job, very interesting. Do you know of photos of other professional organizations or schools, and have you done a comparison of those organizations with our organizations? So anything sort of comparable that you've run across, I guess.
Thank you for asking. Actually, this work stemmed from work that we've done in medical education, and I would say it's actually very similar in medical education with women as, if you will, a very trailing indicator in terms of the history and appearing probably a couple of decades before they do in the state medical boards for the reasons that I think we talked about earlier. So it's not that any part of medicine or law or many other fields was substantially better. It's a similar history.
Got it. I'm looking at the Q&A feed again, Dr. Nora. A comment, this is from another colleague, another historic first of sorts, Dr. Susan Spalding, former, the first woman to serve as the elective chair of the FSMB. Yeah. Susan writes, that was a great summary through photographs. I'm surprised there aren't lots of photographs in the 90s. It seemed like there were photographers everywhere. The women pioneers in medicine were such strong and confident individuals. They laid the groundwork for the rest of us.
Well, I couldn't agree with your comment more. I wasn't around to know about those photographs, but I think they may have been taken but shown in different vehicles or the like that we just didn't see. We have not been completely through the archives, and so we may happen upon some things later on. I should also say we did not go through annual reports, for example, and the like, and those are other examples of documents that frequently may have photographs that would be helpful in understanding this history.
Dr. I'm going to turn to a question that I had in mind after I listened to your presentation, which was, I was wondering, was there's anything that has surprised you in your research so far? I mean, whether it's been for this project, this photographic history, or as part of some of the oral history work that you're already starting?
So I think the distaff was a surprise to me. And I showed pictures of some of the women who played key staff roles in the early histories. And,
Right.
you know, to a very substantial degree, I was surprised because many of these women were there for decades and were described as linchpin and crucial, and yet there's so little known about them. I think that was a surprise and also maybe a bit of a disappointment. And I would say from the oral histories, I am struck at we've done about 12 so far, men and women, who were crucial in professional regulation and a few in medical education as well. And I am struck at the power of their stories in terms of, I don't know yet, but I think that people are drawn to professional regulation as a mission, oftentimes just in response to very deeply held beliefs about the importance of the quality of patient care. I don't sense that it's something that people just kind of choose a menu and say, okay, that's where I'm going to make my professional contribution.
Yeah.
I think it is oftentimes very thought out and a very deeply held commitment to really making the lives of regular people getting medical care better.
Well, and clearly, as the medical regulators, listening to this conversation today, know that's it's a commitment that is one that involves a great deal investment of time and resources for individuals volunteering to do that work, and all it getting in compensation at best a small per diem, if you will. Another
Could I
comment
mention,
from the audience. Yes,
please?
go ahead.
I just, the other thing I'm very interested in, and I would, if folks have insights into this, I appreciate your insights into anything, but really the role of the public member as well. I have a sense that the public member oftentimes was appointed not necessarily because everybody loved the idea of a public member, but there was political pressure to do it. Some boards became very committed to it, and it appears that oftentimes that first public member was also the first woman that had come on the board. And I don't know if that's true, but it looks as though it might be. And so the roles of the public member in really opening the doors for women who later came on as professional members of the board, I think is intriguing. And the other thing that I would say is the role of the state medical boards in really advancing the diversity conversation in many ways, women, but also in other ways nationally, I think is very interesting. And I get a flavor of it. And if others are more aware of things that we should review or would like to talk to us, it would be very interesting to do so.
Excellent. Another comment from the audience, Dr. Nora. This is from Jeff Carter, formerly of the Missouri Board, but actually the chair-elect of the Federation at this time. Jeff writes, thanks so much for this fascinating presentation. The fact that the Minnesota Board was home to several of the first female medical regulators is intriguing. Is there any insight into the circumstances and experiences that sustained that trailblazing diversity in Minnesota?
Well, David, I would say you're more expert on that than I am. Maybe you'd like to offer your thoughts on that first.
Well, I think you hinted at what I suspect is part of the answer, which is the fact that there was this strong networking that was taking place amongst women, not only as physicians in Minnesota, but political activists, suffragettes at that period. And I think the combination of those two elements really just set the stage for a unique situation in which it spanned almost a 20-year period because there were 4 consecutive women that served on that board from about 1899 through about 1917. So it was an unusual situation or circumstance, one that I've not seen duplicated anywhere else in the United States. And to my knowledge, there's pretty much a big gap between the women serving on the Minnesota board and then women beginning to show up on medical boards elsewhere in the country in the 60s and 70s. Here's another. Oh,
there's a
no, you go
history
ahead,
book,
Dr.
Send
Moore.
Us a Lady Doctor, I think it is. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the author. But my work in the Minnesota story reminded me of that book because the pioneer West, what was the West across the years, really seemed to be the opportunity in many cases for women physicians in those early years. And I think we find oftentimes that where there is a lack of medical care, people are oftentimes open to diversity in ways. They are more concerned with quality and care than they are with other things. And so that, I think, is a big part of what happened there as well.
Oh, I think you're right. And you cited Dr. Hutchinson calling out that factor specifically. There's a comment from Sean Parker, formerly of the North Carolina Board. Sean writes, is medical regulation on par, behind, or ahead of other professions or societies in advancing diversity in participation in leadership? He says a thank you, and that he watched with his 13-year-old daughter, and they loved the photos and presentations. So Sean's question was essentially, how do you think medical regulation stacks up? Somewhat on par, a little behind, or maybe a little ahead of the professions or societies?
I don't think I have enough information to really say that at this point. And I'm sorry, but hopefully maybe next summer I'll get invited back and we can look into that more deeply.
Well, I'm already thinking just by seeing some of the folks who've joined us today with Barbara Schneidman, Susan Spalding, in addition to yourself as our guest, maybe we need to make sure we have a fourth or fifth session in this series that kind of focuses on some trailblazers in more recent years.
Well,
There's
certainly got some.
Yes, we do. There is a comment from Dr. Andrea Anderson, also from the Federation's board. Andrea says, excuse me, my screen went dark for a moment. Andrea says, bear with me a moment. Thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering if you could speak to the need for an official historian or archivist to chronicle state medical boards and the Federation.
I think that would be presumptuous of me, but I would applaud seeing such a thing happen and coming out of the Federation. The state medical boards and Federation have a rich, wonderful history. And I would hope that state medical boards are doing this for themselves and the Federation is doing it.
Wonderful coincidence, but just this morning, Dr. Chowdhury, the Federation's president and CEO, sent an email to all executive directors, essentially reminding them that the Federation is creating physical space for research, some of which you did on site here, but also an archive, museum/library, and encouraging any donation. So if there's photographs, old documents, things that you're not sure, do we hang on to them or can we find a permanent home? The Federation is willing and interested and willing to serve in that capacity. So I think Dr. Anderson's question was pretty timely.
May I say also, it's a place where technology is incredibly helpful. I mentioned how welcoming the Federation was to our work on site, and we did a lot of our work on site. But a lot of those journals are also available through the archives and online, and we spent a lot of time in those archives. So that's another great opportunity.
Dr. Nora, I want to shift to a question that I had in mind because this came directly from one of your closing slides. You mentioned in your talk, you talked about culture change, and that culture change takes time, it takes allies, and then you said it takes senior leadership support. And it feels like that last piece in particular is really important as a takeaway for all of us when it comes to what we can do individually to help bring about change at our respective organizations or institutions. I wonder if you could maybe reflect a little bit on that, about the notion of senior leadership support to support culture change.
I think it's just absolutely crucial. Leadership sets the tone and empowers other people to buy into that vision and also empowers things to happen. I also suspect that we are going to see that with our future research because in the oral histories that we have done, several names have come up of people that people we've talked to have identified as absolutely crucial from their perspectives as people that were interested in engaging women in more substantive roles, both in staff roles and in governance roles within the Federation.
Well, Dr. Nora, since you mentioned oral histories, there's one other comment I wanted to read out to you from our viewers. First of all, it's a thank you for the presentation and recognizing the need for this type of research. I'm really looking forward to what the oral interviews yield and the stories and trends that may come to light. So since there's a reference to some of that oral history project, would you like to say a few more words about that initiative?
I would be delighted to. So Carol Clothier and I are taking the lead on this in our group right now. And we are setting up, something that one of the silver linings of the pandemic is we understand we can do things by Zoom now that we used to think we had to do in person.
Yeah.
And so we are setting up in person or Zoom 2-hour interviews with individuals that have a story to tell and either self-identify or identify by others. People, of course, have to be willing to do it. But we have done, as I said, about 12 of these right now. We have another 18 that we are hoping to do this year. They are not all scheduled. And so if people have individuals that they would suggest we talk to, please send their names on. One of the challenges is that some of these people are just lost to history right now in terms of they've passed
Right.
away or the like. And so we're really very interested in talking to people who are interested in the history of professional regulation and the area that we're in particular looking at, diversity within professional regulation and women's history.
Well, Dr. Nora, we've had time for maybe one or two more questions. Let me get back to the audience Q&A. This a follow-up question from Dr. Anderson. She asked, how can state medical boards who may have limited resources do a better job of documenting their histories?
What a great question. And in reality, the history of the Federation is very much the history of the state medical boards. And so I think that is important. My sense of it is to always at least have that box. And if there's something that could be important, making sure that it is saved. Because if it's lost to history, it's lost. There are individuals who are particularly adept at cataloging or managing things. And if they have an avocation for this, I think leadership, if they can give them identified time where they could actually do some of the organization, and then moving things into technology, just because paper is so fragile and different things
Right.
can happen to it. But I think particularly in our not very resource intensive world, if some time can be taken to particularly have people focus on it, to save things, and then as possible to transmit them to technology. I think those are 3 steps that can be taken. The other thing that I would say is the state medical boards are very prominent actors within their state. It may well be that your local university in your state may have people that are particularly interested in medical history, in the history of professional regulation or the like. And so, or there may be graduate students who are looking for a project. And so I think that can also be an opportunity for talented and relatively inexpensive labor of people who want to do this work and would be delighted to be invited.
Well, I think that's an excellent observation you added there, along with those other recommendations. Dr. Nora, we're coming to the close of the hour, so I wanted to just personally thank you. It's been a delight being able to help facilitate some of your research and seeing what wonderful work you've been able to do, you and your colleagues, with this type of research.
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be able to speak to you and all of the listeners today, and thank you for the invitation.
And for those listening, I would just like to remind you that we will be back again on July 26th with our next session of Looking Backward and Moving Forward. At that time, we'll feature a presentation from Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, a medical historian at Northwestern, and she'll be relating the story of Dr. James Burt, the Ohio physician whose 30-year practice as an OBGYN in that state became the basis for a well-known disciplinary case that drew national attention and ultimately became the subject of her recent book, The Love Surgeon, a story of trust, harm, and the limits of medical regulation. I think you'll find that's going to be a fascinating conversation. I hope you'll join us. Thank you, and everyone, have a great day.